So, Mythcorial writes, so, I have a question about your beliefs, and by the way, not at all meant disrespectfully, just curious, what's your belief concerning the central tenets of Christianity? Do you believe there's a hell? If so, what's it like? And for what crimes are people sent there? Do you believe Jesus' life happened literally the way it's described in the Bible? What was he saving us from? Why was such a gruesome sacrifice needed for it? Is he really one with God? And he says, I'm sure you've heard this joke many times. Christianity teaches that God sacrificed himself to convince himself not to send us to hell. How does one go from an atheist who presumably had pretty much that view on Christianity to someone who believes in it all again? To that last point, and I will not elaborate on this at all, uh, because I, I feel like what I'm alluding to here is a very personal experience that's not for anybody but me. I did have experiences in my life that felt like have had in recent years experiences in my life that felt like I was in touch with a transcendent divine power. That's as far as I'll go with that. Um, but the rest of it. So it's interesting. You say, how does one go for now? By the way, I did a video called "Answering Questions About My Faith," which if I miss one of your points in this, it's because it was already covered in that video. Uh, so that was part of it. That was part of realizing that that there is this divine transcendental state. So there's a quote something to remember. It's from Rowan Williams, who is the former Archbishop of Canterbury. Made a point that really resonated with me, which was most atheists are most atheists are criticizing a God that most Christians don't believe in, and it's that Christianity teaches that God sacrificed himself to himself to convince himself not to send us to hell. Well, of course that's absurd. Of course that would be absurd, and of course it would be absurd to believe in something like that. It's one of the first and most important admissions was an admission to myself that that is not what Christians believe. That is a straw man, a straw man portrayal that tries to make it. What you're essentially saying is, if I can say something absurd, or if I can portray what you believe in a very absurd manner, then you are wrong by default. That's again, it's like I don't know if there's a term for it, but it should be like argumentum ad parody or ad ridicule or something like that. Um, so there's that part of it was letting get once you let go of the idea that all of these people believe something absurd and I'm so enlightened and I'm so above this. I'm speaking for myself here. I don't know about you, but I'm so above these adults and everything. Once you let go of that idea and accept the possibility that these people have some belief that is grounded in legitimacy, if you accept that as a possibility, then you are forced to accept the idea that there is a more legitimate interpretation of what you just described. So that's what happened with me. So, do you believe there is a hell? Yes. If so, what is it like, and for what crimes are people sent there? You are asking the wrong question, Grasshopper. There is a book, I alluded to it before in a previous video, there's a book by C.S. Lewis called The Great Divorce that has in my mind, one of the best explanations for heaven and hell. Uh, in hell, in his hell that he presents, just people are not burning in hell and being stuck with pitchforks and all of this nonsense and all that. Hell is just portrayed as this city that's a very drab, uninteresting city where people live and they just feel kind of miserable all the time. It's depression. It's an abyss of depression and despair. And the thing is, it's their own despair and their own. They have these are people that are so completely consumed by their own failures and their own shortcomings, and their own inner turmoil, that they can't experience anything other than this kind of just blah, empty existence. It's a hell that they create for themselves. And what's interesting is in this hell, you can have anything you want by wishing for it, or just calling it up, calling it into existence. You can just instantly have anything you want. And that seems very strange, why would hell be a place where you can have anything you want? Well, because what you immediately realize is that when you can have anything you want without working for it, the meaning and the joy in that thing goes out of it. So you can have anything you want, but you can't you have no ability to enjoy it. And in this hell, and it's a hell where one of his great metaphors that I like is that the you know it rains inside. It rains indoors. Like no matter what kind of house you wish for, it's still going to rain. The rain is still going to seep into your house. And I like that. That it's just a place where you are consumed by your own shortcomings. And I know what that feeling is like. I know what it feels like to be consumed by that to the point that I just can't. I can't even function. You know. I know what that feeling is like. And in the Great Divorce, this group of this group of souls, damned souls, are given a kind of furlough to go up to heaven and decide if they want to stay in heaven. The first thing that they experience is that they step off of the bus. It's a bus that takes them to heaven. They step off the bus and they step onto the grass. We're actually not in heaven yet at this point. We're in the kind of the outskirts of it, the outskirts of the heavenly city, if you will. But they step onto the grass, and their feet are cut by the grass. It's horribly painful. They are just wailing in agony, and it's very strange. Again, why would heaven be this place where people are getting cut, people are getting hurt, and the answer, the reason being that they are not capable yet of living in this place. They are not spiritually developed enough to they are so spiritually thin, as Lewis puts it, that their feet are being cut by the grass. And the people, what immediately happens is, most of the people want to get back on the bus immediately and get away from the pain and go back to hell, where they're free of where this kind of pain doesn't exist. And what's ultimately explained is that the pain that they are suffering is the pain of personal spiritual development. It's not going to be easy. It's going to be tremendously painful, and you're going to have to endure, and you're going to have to develop an endurance for that pain, and in so doing, you will become a spiritually fuller person, and as you develop spiritually, then you can walk on the grass. I've had to come to terms in recent years with a lot of shortcomings that I have. That has not been easy. But the process of doing that has been painful, but it has been a worthwhile process. I would not go back to the person I was before if it meant if it meant being able to undo going through that process. So many of the painful parts of that process are behind me now. I still have a lot. I still have a long, long ways to go. We all do in this life, but I've worked through those painful processes and am a better person for it. And so, when we say that saying we're sent to hell, or that we send ourselves to hell by not believing in God, that is missing the point. God and all of these things are ways of putting a human face on forces that are way, way beyond our perception, our control, and our understanding. we say God is a he in the patriarchal sense because, just culturally, dad is usually thought of as the rule giver and the admonisher and all of that. And so we refer to God often as a he for that reason, just like the more, pagan, earth-oriented religions will refer to God as a female because the life giver and the fertility and all of that, the nurturing aspect. But that these are ultimately metaphors. Um, if one of us, if we are in communion with God, we are not in communion with a bearded guy in a toga sitting on a cloud. First of all, that nowhere is the Christian God described that way. That's actually Zeus. But nevertheless, we are not telepathically communicating to that person, to that person that we call God is it is a way of condensing a highly abstract concept into a human form that we can interact with. That is all. That's what's ultimately happening there. So, for what crimes are people sent there? We are sent there for. It's not that we're sent there. It's not like it's a literal. Again, it's not like there's a literal person that's going hmm. It is a large. It is a metaphor for a larger concept. And in the Great Divorce, one of the great satirical points Lewis makes, most of the characters, the characters that are in hell, don't realize that they're in hell. That's what's keeping them there. It's their own ignorance and their own lack of reflection and their own inability to look at themselves. So much so, I love this. So much so that there is a preacher in hell that is conducting a Bible study group every week. So they don't realize where they are, and and once you realize what's going on, the pain, and again, I'm talking about this all metaphorically because, uh, as far as it sounds like the question that you're asking is like, um, like when you die, are you going to when you open your eyes, what is the architecture of the room you're in going to be like, or that sort of thing? And again, it comes down that is a metaphor. It's like it's like welcome to heaven. Welcome to heaven. Most people like to start with the slip and slide, and then we've got a great bop it tournament going on over there, and it's just everybody have fun all the time, or welcome. Like in the Far Side, welcome to hell. Here's your accordion. Um, that's that is a metaphor, and where a lot of that language and that description of people being flung into hell and burning in hell comes from, you have to remember that the early Christians, and this especially pertains to the Book of Revelation. And I asked a friend of mine from grade school who is now an Episcopal priest. I asked him about Revelation to kind of explain it to me, and he pointed out. He said that the early Christians were being persecuted by the Romans, and end of time stories like Revelation would enter the were very common. The Book of Revelation was not the only end of days story. It's just the one that made the cut, in the at the Council of Nicaea and all of that. And the Book of Revelation is a story. It is meant. It sounds very dark and disturbing if you're coming to it out of dare I say, out of context or taking it in and of itself. But what they're really trying to say there is ultimately God wins, ultimately love wins. Our persecutors will fall by the wayside. So that is a lot, when there's a lot of that fiery language, no pun intended, that's what they're referring to. What they're saying is, these people that are persecuting us now as Christians, the Roman soldiers, all of that, they will, ultimately we will transcend them. We will transcend this, is what's ultimately being said. So, as far as what happens after we die, again, we have a set of metaphors to describe it, but what will actually occur is far more transcendent than that. So that's what really has to be understood, I think, and that's a difficult gap for a lot of, I think, atheists to cross. And again, it's like, the atheist critiques would make more sense in light of, if you were criticizing Zeus and Thor, then they start to make a lot more sense. Christianity, rather, I think, is trying to recognize the nature of the anthropomorphized God as a condensing of a larger concept, and trying to communicate that there is a higher reality and a higher authority out there that is not a literal human being sitting on a cloud throwing lightning bolts. Um, that is not what I believe, and dare I say, I don't know any Christian that does. Um, so again, do you believe Jesus' life literally happened the way it's described in the Bible? The best answer I can give you is essentially yes, and I say that because for two reasons. One, because yes, there are these contradictions in the Bible, and especially in the uh, or New Testament accounts, the Gospels. Yes, there are these contradictions, but there is no contradiction so profound as to negate the overall arc of the story. It's not like the arc being story arc. The overall arc of the story. It's not like there are three Gospels where Jesus is born again or rises again from the grave, and one where he doesn't. Um, so the essential elements remain the same. The window dressing is different, but the essential elements remain the same. And that part of it is what I am still grappling with, and that's why I say I am studying to join the Episcopal Church. There are certain personal steps that I still need to take within myself before I can say this is, I'm ready to truly in my heart say this is what I'm committing to. Um, so as far as it literally occurring and Jesus actually rising from the dead, um, it is a personal process, and that's not a cop out, because I do believe what I've experienced is a transcendental level of understanding and of truth. Like, belief is not just saying it's not just saying I believe this thing arbitrarily. There is a transcendental experience of certainty, and so that transcendental experience points me to the correctness of, or the rightness of, the New Testament accounts. However, you see that I'm still tiptoeing around it because of where I'm at. This is not an on-off switch. It's an ongoing process. So that's why I say essentially yes. And um, what is he saving us from, and why was such a gruesome sacrifice needed? Is he really one with God? So, bringing it back to your original thing about God needed to sacrifice himself to himself to convince us not to convince himself not to send us to hell. I think my interpretation of all of this, and this is why I say I'm not trying to convert anybody. Ultimately, you will. Ultimately, whatever you believe, you're going to have to find those answers for yourself. Um, but my interpretation of it is that you are coming you're coming from a culture that, or you're looking at a very specific evolution in the human race, where we transition from that notion, the Old Testament notion of God being an almighty authority rule giver, to the idea of God being someone who can understand with and understand and sympathize with human beings, wants to form a personal relationship with them, that kind of thing. And this is where I'm going to give you a taste of my own personal beliefs, and this is why I say you're going to want to say, well, Christians don't think that, the Bible doesn't say this. This is my own personal interpretation. Okay? We say that God is omniscient, meaning that God can know everything that there is to be known. God is portrayed consistently throughout the Bible as learning throughout a process. What is the first thing that God does? He creates the earth and the skies, and he sees that it is good. God is capable of knowing everything that there is to be known, and is the complete repository of all knowledge. But that knowledge still, in the Bible, that knowledge is portrayed as being something that is acquired over time. And so, if we accept the idea that God's knowledge and almighty understanding of the universe is not an automatic understanding of the universe, but an endless capacity to understand the universe, and to understand, by the universe I mean existence, an endless capacity to understand existence, then the narrative of what happens starts to make a little more sense. God does with Jesus Christ, God does something that he has never done before, which is he experiences the human experience from the vantage of from the vantage of a human being. What has been happening up until this point in the Old Testament? What do we see happening? We see rules being imposed on people, and God thundering down on people, demanding that they follow his rules, and consistently they don't. Consistently, everything goes to shit immediately. This is not working. So this is clearly not working. God has to acquire a new level of understanding about human beings. And that happens in his earthly incarnation through Jesus. In having that earthly incarnation, it is now understood, or God comes to understand the transcendental, what the nature of humanity's next step, and where humanity has to go next, and how indeed the concept must relate to human beings. So, Jesus proclaiming, "Forgive them, they know not what they do." This is not why does God have to convince himself? Because if we are made in the image of God, we are beings that have the capacity to understand, but we have to acquire the knowledge. If that is the idea, I think the idea being that you're talking about a being that exists outside of time, so he has to interact again, this is metaphorical, but he would have to interact with time on the terms of time, if that makes sense. It's we're given to imagine, if you have it's like if you're capable of perceiving infinity, then it's like you have a film strip in front of you that you can scroll back and forth from the beginning to the end, like the game Braid or something. You can just scroll back and forth. I think, again, I keep coming back to C.S. Lewis, who should be canonized in my opinion. But I come back to C.S. Lewis, who said, if Shakespeare and Hamlet were to meet, it would have to be Shakespeare's doing. He could write himself into the play. The perception of a being that exists outside time cannot have the perception of a being that is inside time. To truly understand his creation, God had to experience existence from their perspective. why was such a gruesome sacrifice needed for it? I don't know that it was necessarily needed for it, other except to say that that was the circumstances by which it occurred. Um, so I don't know that it's necessarily needed. I guess it could hit, uh, but at the same time, I think the brutal display of it gives it a level of profundity. What would it be? How significant would it be if he just offed himself in front of a couple of people and popped back to life? That would not be that significant. It would not be that impressive. So it is a very grandiose, over the top uh, public display. But that's my sense of it. That's my interpretation. And Carl Jung wrote about this. Max Derritt has a great series on YouTube about Ion. It's called Ion, Jordan Peterson's Nightmare, which is talking about the book Ion by Carl Jung and examining why it affected Jordan Peterson so profoundly. Highly recommend that book um, because it makes the case that you know the existence of God would necessitate if we are made in God's image, then what we are exists on the transcendental state of what God is. God is and it's essentially that God is a human being, a human being that exists on that transcendental level. I'm kind of thinking out loud as I say this. Obviously, is why I'm stuttering. But but to that point, to Jesus being one with God, uh, it's it, it it really it's kind of like God has to experience the human experience, and part of that is going to be experiencing what it is like to be a human being apart from God. So to come into human form as Jesus Christ, Jesus still talks to God as a separate entity, because that is his. Put it this way: Jesus is the expression of God within the finite existence. And so, being that he becomes a finite extension of God, he is essentially interacting with a separate concept that is infinite. So, it is still, despite being one and the same, it is still an entity within the finite, referring to the infinite, if that makes sense. Uh, so that is what I would say is the oneness with God. Um, and that is why if we entertain that idea, a lot of again a lot of people will look at it's kind of like there's a question. People say, well, if God is omnipotent, which means all powerful, can God create a three-sided triangle? I mean, of course he can do that. Can he create a four-sided triangle? If God is omnipotent, can he create a four-sided triangle? Well, omnipotent, omnipotent means you have the potential. You are capable of all that has the potential to happen. There is no potential of creating a four-sided triangle. Therefore, no, God could not do that. Um, so that's the term. The terminology gets simplified and bastardized to a point that we really stop thinking about what it could actually mean. And so hopefully that answers your questions a little bit. It really the guide rule that I would give to any atheist that's genuinely wondering about these things, not to the asshole atheists that just want to throw stones and that kind of thing, but to the genuine atheists that are really wondering about these things. The guiding principle that I have to give you is what Rowan Williams said, that most atheists believe are trying to disprove the existence of a God that most Christians don't believe in. Those atheistic interpretations that are meant to highlight the apparent absurdity of these stories, of the biblical stories, is not what most Christians are working off of. Now, don't get me wrong. There are the creationists. I am still opposed to creationism. I still think creationism is a laughingstock. It is still absurd. Nowhere in the Bible, nowhere in Christian texts are we actually called upon to believe that the Earth is 6,000 years old. That all of these claims, that is patently absurd. But don't take the people who have weak arguments and presume that because there are people with weak arguments that all the arguments are therefore weak. That's a basic law of logic. To say if you say all elephants are pink, Dolly is an elephant, therefore Dolly is pink. That's internally correct, but the simple reality is that elephants aren't pink. So the same thing there. Just because there are some people in a group that have really dumb ideas doesn't mean that all of the people in a group have really dumb ideas. Some may have something that's genuinely profound. So hopefully that answers your question. Take care.